Thank you all for being here today. I made a quick joke with one of my Liberian colleagues that it was almost as hard to get everybody in the room than it was to write the actual dissertation. So, but no, I do appreciate you guys coming. I think since the last time we met, in this room as a committee, I've grown immensely as a scholar and a researcher. So I appreciate the feedback that you all provided me that day. Everybody in this room knows that there's no way you can fake writing a dissertation. You have to be committed to it, not only time-wise, not only in a library, but you also have to be passionate about what you're doing. And working and living in Liberia the last couple of years, I've seen the great importance that intercultural collaboration at the international level plays, especially for a developing country like me, where we have to engage a lot of other partners. As a result, my research question was not only for me, it was not only for the country of Liberia, but it was for the academic community as well. My research question read, what theoretical model outlining the process of intercultural collaboration at the international level can be surmised after analyzing the collaborative writing process of the 27 members who made up the United Nations high-level panel on the post-2015 agenda? Now again, this question is important for the academic community just for the simple fact as globalization continues to take hold and we have a lot of cross-border policies that are occurring. So now we as the academic community have to continue by presenting theories and foundational work to be able to work on, to be able to look at how these international panels work. The members of the high-level panel, I can argue that this is one of the most high-profile panels ever put together. Of the 27 people, we have about 5 current or former heads of states. We have Queen Rania of Jordan, we have secretaries of state, ministers of finance, but we were accounted for as academics. That guy back there, he's of Indian descent, and he's a professor at MIT. So again, we have a lot of different genres, different people coming together to create this one universal document. I'm going to jump, of course I talk about communications and everything else, and we know that communications and culture is basically intertwined. But what I want to focus on here in my presentation is technical communications, which is the art and science of making complex information accessible, usable, and relevant. Now when we talk about technical communications, I'm looking at the 27 panel members as technical communicators who were knowledge creators and problem solvers. So now these technical communicators have to ask themselves, why is this communication important? Why is it needed? What will users do with this information? Do users share common membership in the specific discourse community? When looking at technical communications as well, it involves several variables. 1/3 writing proficiency, 1/3 problem solving skill, as well as the 1/3 ability to work with other people. This is what I like to focus on my next couple of slides. When we talk about collaborative writing, especially in this international setting, Robert Davis, the scholar, talks about people collaborate, especially in the writing, when they have inefficiency, insecurity, or inability. Now, Lowry states that collaborative writing is more effective than single author writing because it leads people to think outside of the box, learn, and knowledge create. When we're looking at this, invention and negotiation, again, negotiation is key because when you have these 27 people who are all strong-willed, very strong-minded, have philosophical mandates, you understand that there's going to be a lot of negotiation going on, as well as revision, although they don't necessarily have to all happen in this particular order. So my lit review, what I wanted to do with my lit review, I basically put into 3 separate categories. I wanted to look at the roles of collaborative writing, the activities, as well as the strategies of collaborative writing. When we talk about the roles of collaborative writing, I didn't necessarily want to look at the writer, the consultant, on face value. I wanted to look at what influences the writer, the consultant, the editor. Because as we know, writing is always ideological and it's always political. So as a result, again, I wanted to look at what influenced the roles of the people who would collaborate. Culture. Culture is obviously the first thing that we have to kind of focus on when we're looking at this. Human beings are products of culture, and culture helps to control communications. Of course, I have the intertwined hands there again because of the interconnectedness of culture and communication. Culture, essentially, is ongoing struggle of traditions, practices, and values of memberships. Essentially, you have all these people coming together to put forward what they think and how they think that life should be lived. Language ideology is another facet of communications and culture because its construction is generally supported by power holders, which in the long run makes it hegemonically dominant. So By this I mean the political leaders of a nation basically, in a way, controls how the language is formed in that culture. So that's why when you look at gender relations, you look at child socialization, schooling, laws, etc., it's going to depend a lot on the political leadership. Now in this international panel, when you have a lot of political leaders, you understand that there's going to be a lot of discussion, negotiation, and compromise occurring once again. Next was the activities of collaborative writing. Again, brainstorming, research, planning, etc. Not looking at it at face value again. I wanted to look at why these activities of international collaboration occurs. I looked at rhetoric and its Aristotelian approach to the common good. I also looked at globalization and the global consciousness. And finally, I looked at development communications. When looking at rhetoric, especially in classical rhetoric, we know that it puts forward the idea that practical wise men, and I added women, but practical wise men and women come together to basically put forward a morally balanced state. You know, you have a state of justice, equality, and genuine good. We also know that Kennedy talks about rhetoric came to the forefront because there was less room for this guy, the hero at arms. So, now, the next thing is globalization and the global consciousness. And I thought this picture was perfect. I don't know if you're looking at it, Professor Valentine, but you know, it's a picture of essentially puzzles being put together. This is our world trying to come together to figure out how to live in peace and unity. And because of the different values, the different ideologies, religions, etc., etc., you have globalization and the global consciousness come to the forefront, because globalization is basically the receptiveness to and understanding of cultures other than your own. Next is development communications, which I talked about in my lib review. Now, this thought put forward the idea that there are no solutions to problems that are imposed on local communities from the outside. So basically it's about not about coming to tell people what to do, it's about working with a situation with the community. So when you look at number 2, it talks about the social animator. The social animator is a communicator. And now, basically it says that whoever is trying to bring forward this change, these policies, should be from the community itself. Example of this is when you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was in the 1950s. Okay? Out of the entire panel, there was one person from Asia and one person from Latin America, none from Africa. Fast forward 70 years plus later at the high-level panel, of this 27 people, 17 of them were from Asia, South America, or Africa. So you can see the kind of shift in the idea of how development communications occurs. Number 3, 4, and 5, again, it talks about the community development model. Strategies, which is my last chapter of the lit review I'll talk about. Strategies of collaborative writing. Again, you can look at the simple writer, the scribe, etc. I wanted to look at intercultural communications and communications competence, because I felt like these are the things that kind of affects the strategies of how people, of how intercultural collaboration at the international level occurs. New world information communications order, as well as group formation. Now, when you look at intercultural components, we know that knowledge, but it's not necessarily knowledge about a specific culture. You have to have knowledge about just how social groups are formed. You also have to have skills and the attitudes. By attitudes, I mean you have to be able to put aside your prejudices and have openness to other cultures to be able to think how they think and be able to basically form some type of dual identity, which I'll discuss about a little bit later. Now, international communications. Originally, I found the first definition of Fortner, who defines it as communication that occurs across international borders. But again, I thought this was entirely too simplistic for the level and the magnitude of what international communications does. So I found Modi's definition, which talks about mass-mediated communication between 2 or more countries with different ideologies, who differ culturally in level of economic dependence. So again, this is what I wanted to focus on as you're looking at these various intercultural collaboration at the international level. Now, the New World Information and Communications Order essentially is a protest whose proponents argue that the structure and operation of global communication had grossly inadequate consequences. An example of this, and this came about basically in the 70s, okay? You had a lot of African countries at that point gaining independence. You also had a lot of Asian and Latin American countries coming into their own and saying, you know what, we want our own self-autonomy. We want a place at the table as opposed to being told what to do. So this is kind of, when you say many voices, one world, this is kind of the acknowledgement of that. Looking at the methodology of my paper, what I did, and of course in our field, we're always going to, most likely we're going to tend to lean to qualitative research. And not only qualitative research, which is to construct knowledge, but I also wanted to do an instrumental case study, which basically was to use the high-level panel as a case to basically redraw a generalization out of basically to put together a theory to say this is how intercultural communication works at the international level based on this specific case study. The methods of analysis: semi-structured interviews, document analysis, as well as descriptive research are the three basically methods of analysis I used when conducting my study. My interview participants. The first person was I was able to interview was President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was my president of Liberia. Of course, she's extremely knowledgeable. She's won the Nobel Peace Prize the last 5 or 6 years. She's been voted one of the top 10, top 20 most powerful women in the world. She, like I said, she's extremely knowledgeable in the international arena. The next person was Ms. Amina Mohammed, who was Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. Prior to this, she ran a $1 billion fund for the Millennium Development Goals in Nigeria. Third person was the advisor to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Dr. David Hallam. Again, extremely knowledgeable and very open, and he was one of, like I said, one of the Prime Minister's chief advisors. Dr. Homi Karas, he was the catalyst of this entire thing. He was the lead author, and I've never seen somebody under as much pressure as he was having prime ministers, presidents, Secretary of States, queens call him, because all of them, again, like I talked about when we talk about culture being an ongoing struggle, all of them are trying to put together and have him put on paper what they think should be relevant in any international document. So again, he did a tremendous job. And finally, Jessica Espy, who was a research and policy advisor first for Save the Children, but we interacted with her so much, she did such a good job. Every time our Liberian government officials interacted with her, we had to steal her for a couple of months. So she came over to Liberia and worked with us. Now, when talking about descriptive research, I looked at the demographics of the panel: age, gender, native language, place of origin. I also looked at the meetings held. There were 6 meetings held on 4 different continents. I wanted to look at them to be able to see if I could determine the structure as to how these meetings are held. Thematic input from outside organizations. What is the international community talking about when they get together? What are the topics being discussed? And finally, the communique, which are the international communiques put out by the panel itself. Document analysis, I did terms of reference, frame questions, and communiques. In that, I mean, I was able to code all 3 documents: open, axial, and selective coding, to be able to peel back the layers and decipher what exactly is being said, what message is being put forward. So, I felt strongly that these 3 methods would give me a holistic, broad-based account of exactly how this intercultural collaboration at the international level works. Now, my findings, I was able to put my findings into 2 separate categories. The first chapter of findings focused on the cultural and process-driven influences of collaborative writing. My chapter objectives were elements to consider when constituting an international and culturally diverse panel, group interaction and decision-making when having to build a consensus, as well as issues that arise within intercultural and international settings due to globalization and development communications. Now, first and foremost, when you talk about group formation, okay, diversity is a necessity. So now, in a legitimate international panel, you have to account for every region of the world. You do this, obviously you can't get everywhere, so you do this by doing regional representation. Believe it or not, this is the face of Asia, okay? These 9 people represented the values, the philosophies, the ideologies of 4.2 billion Asians, all people who live on the continent of Asia. Of course, you have the president of Indonesia, you have Queen Rania of Jordan, you have the mayor of Istanbul in Turkey, you have a Nobel Peace Prize winner from Yemen. Again, the list goes on and on, even from South Korea and China, Timor-Leste. So again, a broad base of people with different ideas, but yet representing the face of Asia. So now you ask, how do members resist group induction? Okay. I talk about language ideology in my lit review, and then also briefly here, but language ideology, again, deals with the fact that people with different native languages come up and start to think a certain way, again, because of political influences. So language ideology, of the 27 people who were available, 16 of them spoke different native languages. Educational accomplishments, of all the 27 people, 35% of them had PhDs, 45% of them had masters. The 20% who quote unquote only had bachelors, they as well were extremely well educated. Graça Machel, for example, she is best known for being the wife of Nelson Mandela. But she herself has got 3 honorary doctorate degrees, so again, very well educated people were on this panel. And this is how I suggest you resist group induction, just for the simple fact you have these people who are strong-minded, strong-willed, they have strong philosophical direction, and they know exactly what they want to see and how they think the world should look. Of course, in career success, when you have presidents, you have the CEO of Unilever was there, which is the 3rd largest private company in the world. So you have these people through a career success. So I took out an excerpt from my work on page 125 when I was talking about basically the group of people who made up this panel. Consistency was exhibited when considering the educational credentials of the panelists as well as their age. Individuals in their mid-50s with graduate degrees were selected more often than not. Diversity came into play when the selection had to consider all things that go beyond the control of an individual, but yet defines them. This included their culture, their native language, their gender, and their place of origin. The next thing I looked at was the high-level panel meetings themselves. Like I said, there was 2 meetings in New York, 1 in London, 1 in Monrovia, and 1 in Bali. Okay. That's how it was structured. So I wanted to look at these meetings to see exactly how they were structured. Now, I was able to look at it, and from all the papers and everything that occurred, I was able to come up with somewhat of a 5-step cyclical model of intercultural meetings. Basically, the key here was the interaction with the community, which put forward a community development model. When looking at the thematic input from outside organizations, essentially globalization has altered conventional, national-based political belief systems and opened the door to a variety of new global political ideologies. In short, culture is now about borders. And that's pretty much what I have. During the discussions, during every single panel meeting, there was not one thing that discussed any national discussion. There was no country-specific issues that were discussed. Everything had to do with religion, education, healthcare, disabilities, genders, etc., etc. But again, nothing nation-specific. They talked about Arab-specific issues, African-specific issues, but not one nation. So that's why I said culture is now about borders, because every issue that you find in one country, you can easily find in the next. So my summary of findings for this chapter. This study identifies certain characteristics that are found within the typical individual who will be selected to participate in an intercultural and international panel. It proposed a meeting structure in which to elicit true social transformation through community interaction. And finally, the international order of states and shared cultures, however you want to define it, arguably supersedes the autonomy of individual nation states. The next chapter I looked at was managing the process of international collaboration. I wanted to ascertain the role of the terms of reference, again through coding. I also wanted to determine the role and importance of framing questions, again through open, actual, and selective coding, and see how I can utilize to create group consensus. I also wanted to establish both the structure of international communiques as well as its impetus. Now, the findings of the terms of reference, first and foremost, it took on a life of its own. It took on an importance that I did not see coming even well beyond halfway through until I really started to talk to the individuals who wrote this, and then I started to realize how important it was. But TRR served as an explicit guide and continuous reference point throughout the collaborative process of drafting the report. Now, when I got to the actual phase of the TRRs, I found that they basically represented the 7 circumstances of rhetoric: the who, the what, when, where, why, in what manner, and by what means. Essentially, when we look at Bennett talks about the 7 circumstances of rhetoric to be used as an investigative tool, which I fully agree with. But I also add another caveat. I think these 7 circumstances of rhetoric can also be used as directional parameters in collaboration. So the excerpt I got, I pulled out of my work on page 209, is the current question of what guides the decisions of writers as they write, especially in a collaborative setting, should be amended to read, what guides the decisions of collaborative writers before they write. Now, this is kind of my summarized table, coded table, which ends up, the terms of reference ends up with a selective code of process of collaboration. The framing questions I found, they were used to create dual identity. And when I say dual identity, I mean people who can relate to other cultures other than their own and be open and willing to kind of accept different modes of thinking. So initially in my lit review on page 14, I asked the question, how should the purpose and parameters of a document be decided upon when an international document is being crafted? The next question I asked is, which individual or by what standard of ideology identifies a problem that needs to be solved? Framing questions, I was able to code them into 5 separate categories: historical reflection, the way forward policies, implementation and accountability, as well as building a consensus. All 5 of these, in any international panel, you're going to find, and they're going to have to answer and address these 5. So although it's applicable to the high-level panel, you're also going to find these 5 things. If you want to come up with a consensus policy in an international document, you're going to find these 5 things present. So again, like I said, it was used as a consent building approach. And again, another excerpt I use from my work: framing questions can be used to serve as a tool to achieve a multicultural environment, low levels of intolerance or prejudice, positive mutual attitudes among the various ethno-cultural groups that constitute the society, and establish a degree of attachment to the overall group. Essentially, you're creating what Bartel calls the group's we-ness, when they can identify and basically commit to a certain cause by the group. Now, globalization must be flexible. What I mean by globalization must be flexible, you see I have a lot of hands coming from a lot of different places. Now, North America and Europe can be considered global, and it could be considered international. But what they would come up with would be arguably completely different than what Asian panelists and African panelists who would get together to discuss. So again, when I say globalization must be flexible, globalization, depending on who makes the panel, will change. So these 27 members came up with certain policies, okay? These policies would be completely different if you change half of them. So again, globalization is global but flexible. The 6 steps of writing an international communique, I want to just have you focus on step 3 and 4, which is outreach efforts and to display solidarity. Again, talks about community development and participatory development models. Generally, technical models of communication, they account for purpose, audience, and process. What I wanted to add to this debate and discussion was again, to interact with the community for who you're making these policies for. So instead of looking at the community and have perceptions of what you think they want, the next step is to be able to engage them, and not only engage them, but also have them help you write it. So in my work, I write technical writers, and therefore technical communication models must incorporate and illustrate in a more overt fashion their targeted audience into the actual writing and decision-making process. So the summary of my finding for this second and final chapter: the terms of reference, which can be coded as a process-informing document, ultimately has much more of an influence on the final product of intercultural collaboration at the international level than I originally thought. When in an intercultural or international setting, by assimilating individual answers to framing questions that address cultural or ideological issues, the merged responses can be used as a tool to create dual identity for group members and shared beliefs for the group as a whole. And finally, I came up with the idea that technical communications models must make more of a concerted effort to involve their targeted audience within the decision-making process and the actual drafting of the international documents. Again, this was predicated on the idea of community development model and how important this is for international documents. Just for the simple fact, because people now want to be involved and have, like I said, when you go back to the New World Information and Communications Order, people want to be involved in the process. People want to have a say in their future, have self-autonomy, as opposed to being told what to do. Now, this is my final excerpt I'm going to read, which kind of sums up everything I was able to do. Theoretically, and based on the basic assumptions of ethnocentric principles, the idea of interculturally collaborated documents should not be a realistic achievement because of the term's basic premise, which contends that groups naturally dislike each other. But when you consider, as this study does, the implications of cultural studies, which details how cultural practices lead groups to struggle for cultural domination, you have language ideology, which believes that represent political interests and therefore motivation to influence foreign policy, rhetoric and its ability to empower the many, global consciousness, receptiveness to foreign cultures, and the development communications, which stipulates that people come together to identify and solve problems. You quickly understand why the engagement of intercultural and international collaboration is necessary. Now, this was my extremely general, but in any intercultural collaboration at the international level, from looking at the high-level panel itself, this is my generalized model of intercultural collaboration. First, you have to have process. How do you have process? You have to establish the terms of reference, the 7 circumstances of rhetoric: the who, what, when, where, why, in what manner, and by what means. That's a necessity, and that has to be first. Next is selection. Your selection has to be diverse yet equal. Diversity needs to be present in the group leadership as well as its members. And equality needs to be exhibited regarding gender, native language, and regional representation. Finally, you have compromise. Choose to achieve the compromise ideology. First, you have to identify, your group members have to have dual identity. Secondly, the establishment of a shared group belief by all members. And third, work with the local community to produce an evolved shared belief by both group members as well as the community. Finally, this is me telling the president that I figured out how to do intercultural collaborations at the international level. But thank you. That's my presentation.